Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This video you are about to watch, along with all of the ones to follow, will be focused on explaining how various TV shows, games, movies, and books exemplify different aspects of storytelling and how we can incorporate the lessons these IPs teach into our own personal works. Now, while I could go on explaining the format of these videos, I think it would be more instructive to show you what this channel is about throughout this video instead of telling you about it in this introduction. With that said, let's dive right in. So I know I named this video Setting the Scene, but really what it's about is how to introduce the various concepts that go into world building into the very beginning of your story in an effective way. And I'm going to be using the very first episode of Avatar the Last Airbender as an example. The reason why I chose Avatar the Last Airbender as the subject for this video is because I believe that the show effectively demonstrates many principles that go into world building, and I also believe that by studying this first episode, we can all improve our own writing on how to effectively introduce our story and our world to our audience. And I will be exploring how this show masterfully layers in world building into its first episode in the following ways. Crafting a setting, creating culture through character design, establishing bending as a power system, and introducing the primary motivation for each member of the main cast. In the first episode of Avatar the Last Airbender, there are 5 primary locations where the story takes place, and they are the open ocean, the village of the Southern Water Tribe, Zuko's ship, the area with the penguins, and the abandoned Fire Navy ship. Each of these locales offers something unique to the story, and I would like to take some time to explore each of them in depth. The opening shot of the episode is of the vast ocean surrounding the Southern Water Tribe, and we can already glean quite a lot of information from just this one image. The first real thing to think about here is why Michael Dante DiMartio and Brian Conzanito, sorry if I butchered the pronunciation of those names by the way, I'm terrible with names, chose to have their story start here instead of anywhere else, like in the Fire Nation. This is relevant to us because working out why established, successful writers made the choices that they make can help us decide what kinds of decisions to make in our own works. After all, what better way is there to learn than by studying the people who have already succeeded at whatever it is you want to do? So, what does this opening shot tell us? Well, for starters, it tells us that the world is vast and can be used to symbolize the scale of the story to come. It is also empty, save the boat carrying Sokka and Katara. Now, if I were writing the story, those pieces of information would be all I need to write a large portion of the first chapter, and here's why. Actually, before I continue, I think I should elaborate a bit on my perspective when I'm experiencing a story. I've written 2 unpublished manuscripts, and a side effect of the time and effort I invested into them is that when I digest stories told in visual media, I think about how they could be transposed onto the page in the form of the written word. This change in my perspective was the inspiration behind this channel and how I will be analyzing the content featured in these videos moving forward. Now, the reason why I brought that up is because when I was re-watching this episode in preparation for making this video, I actively thought about who the point of view character for this portion of the story should be. And to me, the best point of view character for this episode is Katara. Okay, so why does that matter? Well, in my experience in writing my manuscripts, few things, if anything, are more important than understanding who your point of view character is for any particular part of the story. I say that because the point of view character is the vessel your audience is using to experience your world, so possessing an intimate understanding of their perspective is paramount to creating an immersive experience. Wrapping back around to the opening scene in Avatar the Last Airbender, if we watch what happens from the perspective of Katara, then this empty expanse of water becomes much more interesting. I'm going to be skipping ahead a bit here by talking about Katara's past and how that influences her. But I think that's okay because as a writer, you should have a decent understanding of what your characters experienced before the story started and where you want them to go throughout the story. It's also necessary when it comes to world building because everyone sees the world differently, and the most effective stories portray their world differently based on which character is the POV at any given time. Going back to Katara as my example for this point, for us as the audience, when we watch this scene, all we see is a large expanse of water, some icebergs, and a boat carrying 2 kids, but for Katara, it is so much more. First, she's wearing a heavy coat indicating to her that it's cold. I know it's pretty surface level, but even surface level details are important when writing an effective introduction to your story. Second, the only people in this scene are Sokka and Katara, which can be used to symbolize how Katara feels alone since her mother died and her father went off to fight the Fire Nation. Sokka's presence can be used to show how she knows that she's not truly alone since her brother has suffered the same loss she has, but even though he's there, it's not enough to thaw the icy pain the loss of her parents has left her with. She's also the only waterbender in her tribe, thus making her feel even more isolated regardless of her brother's presence. If I were writing this episode, and more specifically this scene, as a chapter in a novel, I would invest at least the first several paragraphs describing Katara's surroundings and the physical effects they are having on her. However, while necessary, environmental descriptions are not enough to hook an audience, and as such, I would also weave in a couple select sentences hinting at Katara's pain and inner turmoil. But, and please listen closely for this incredibly important point, I would not mention her parents, the war with the Fire Nation, or her being the only waterbender in the tribe. The key to what makes this first episode so good at introducing its world is how it understands and executes pacing. This scene does not mention any of her inner turmoil because that would be telling and not showing. Instead, it slowly trickles in more and more information slowly throughout to show us what we need to know instead of telling us, and I would write it in much the same way. The next main setting in the first episode of Avatar the Last Airbender is Zuko's ship. Now, I don't really know if this is going to be controversial or not, but most of the time, I am not the biggest fan of cutting away to a different point of view character in a different setting mid-episode. And sadly for Avatar the Last Airbender, this applies to Zuko's sections of episode 1. Now, I understand the value of his scenes, which is why I'm covering them in this video about introducing your world, but if I were writing this story, I would have Zuko be the point of view character of episode 2 and work the concepts introduced in his parts of episode 1, like introduction to firebending, into that episode. That said, Zuko is a part of this episode and his sections do introduce us to the Fire Nation, so I will still be covering them in this video. As for this section of the video, there isn't much to talk about since the setting is literally just Zuko's warship. A potential exception here that would add some more variety to the environmental descriptions would be if a scene or two of him under the deck were added. In the previous part of the video, I spent a fair bit of time talking about how Katara's past should be used to both color and symbolize her perception of the environment we are introduced to her in, and the same absolutely applies to Zuko. Now, I adore Zuko as a character. Truth be told, he and Iroh are a significant portion of the reason why I revere this show as much as I do, and a lot of that adoration comes from his past and how he grows throughout the story. If I were writing Zuko's introduction in a novel, I would focus on having my environmental descriptions symbolize the version of Zuko we first see. The exterior of the ship is representative of his harsh demeanor, while the burning coal that fuels the ship would represent the painful hate motivating him. Going a bit further with this example, the plume of smoke would symbolize the toxic effect his unresolved trauma is having on him, and the cold, icy waters around the ship represent how Zuko sees the world. Again, just like with Katara, I would not mention anything specific about his past like how he hates Ozai, because that would be too much too soon. Patience is a virtue, and a story is made or broken by its pacing. You can prevent yourself from info dumping by weaving Zuko's interactions with Iroh into your environmental descriptions and create an intriguing hook without giving the game away by focusing on Zuko's frustrations without elaborating on why he's frustrated just yet. The third main setting I want to talk about is the village of the Southern Water Tribe. In my opinion, this village is the best example of world building through showing, not telling, in the episode. A lot of important information is revealed in this village, but none of it comes off as forced or out of place because the writers took the time to demonstrate every point that gets brought up in dialogue before it's talked about. But before that, since Katara is our point of view character, we need to think about how she perceives her village and how we can use her perception to convey the information we want to get across. This village is the only home she has ever known, which in turn means that the villagers are the only people she has ever known. Because of that, were I writing this section in a novel, I would invest some page time to her interactions with her friends and family. As far as I'm aware, Sokka, Katara, and Gram Gram are the only named characters in the village, so in order to transpose this information to the written word, I'd have to come up with some names, but that's not that big of a deal. Now, to be clear, there's no real need to name every character in the village, but adding a few pages of scenes where Katara is interacting with her community can go a long way with world building. First off, since this is her home, this village is her safe place, and it would be bad writing to have her actively acknowledge it to herself, since that is telling and not showing. Instead, I would demonstrate how happy and comfortable she is interacting with her village to show how she feels about her home. Secondly, since she brought an airbender back to the village, it would make sense for the older women in the village, like Gram Gram, to comment on the war. Having Katara overhear these comments in passing is an effective way to introduce the concept of the war. In the scene before she meets Aang, Katara brings up that her mother is gone while yelling at Sokka. So if I were writing the episode, I would have Katara overhear Gram Gram talking about the war while interacting with a kid in the village. Then, after hearing about the war, I would invest in page time to Katara actively thinking about her mother. By ordering the series of events in that way, the various concepts are introduced in a natural, sensible way, which in turn makes the story easier to follow and won't leave the audience feeling overwhelmed or confused. And that, really, is the purpose behind this video. As a writer, I want people to read my books when I eventually get them published, and I'm sure any fellow writers or creators watching this video feel the same way. To that end, the way we go about introducing our worlds will make or break our stories for many potential fans, which makes understanding how to layer in information absolutely critical. Because, as I just mentioned, people tend to give up on stories when they feel overwhelmed and confused. So if you want to increase your odds of retaining a higher percentage of potential fans, learning how to disperse your world building in a similar manner to Avatar the Last Airbender should be an extremely important priority for you. Going back to the village to further elaborate on how the show disperses its information, if you watch closely, you'll notice that there's not a single adult male in the entire village. This is explained in a future episode when it's revealed that all the men left to fight the Fire Nation, but that demonstrates how the writers world build by showing you something before they explain why it's important. There's quite a bit more I could say about this village, but I'm going to touch on quite a few of these points later on in this video. So now I'm going to move on to talk about the next setting. Our fourth setting in the first episode of Avatar the Last Airbender is the area with the penguins. Now, admittedly, it is a pretty minor location and we don't spend very much time here, but even so, I believe that's worth covering in this video for a couple of reasons. The first reason is the penguins themselves. Earlier in the episode, Katara frees Aang from the ice he had spent the past 100 years in. Shortly after that, they have the first interaction where Aang asks her to go penguin sledding with him. The concept of penguin sledding is goofy, but it serves to both demonstrate Aang's childlike innocence and add a unique charm to the show. The setup of Aang's question is paid off when he and Katara find the colony of penguins and they go sledding. In addition to that, the show's attempt at creating a unique charm is validated and further reinforced when we see that the penguins have 4 wings. Neither Katara or Aang act surprised when they see the 4-winged penguins waddling around, indicating to the audience that this is normal. This serves as a microcosm for the various other types of wildlife we experience throughout the show and plants the seed in our minds to expect a certain kind of wackiness moving forward. The other main reason I wanted to cover this setting is because of its tone and how it changes throughout the scene. From the time the scene starts with Aang finding the initial penguin and chasing after it, to its conclusion when they find the Fire Navy ship in the area, is covered in a soft, soothing light. The gentle colors used here reflect the safety and comfort our point of view character Katara is feeling, and her actions support the color palette. However, her demeanor changes when they emerge from the other side of the ice tunnel, and the way the colors darken in the tunnel is a visual indicator of the shift Katara is about to experience. While it may seem like this kind of imagery is best suited for visual media, I would argue that taking the time to describe the colors that you're setting in your writing can go a long way in establishing the appropriate mood within your audience, so it shouldn't be overlooked. The final setting present in the first episode of Avatar the Last Airbender is the abandoned Fire Navy ship. Earlier in the video, I mentioned how I personally do not really like it when shows do a point of view swap mid-episode, but the imagery in this scene is enhanced because of the presence of Zuko sections. What do I mean by this? Well, it's pretty simple. I feel that the writers convey quite a bit of information to us if we take the time to compare and contrast the two Fire Navy ships. The first piece of information we can glean by comparing the two is that Zuko's ship has a sleeker design and looks a touch more modern. In addition, the abandoned Fire Navy ship is stuck in the ice while Zuko's ship is sailing unimpeded through the ocean. To me, this contrasting imagery can be representative of the past and the future. But going back to Katara, since she is our POV character, this setting does a great job at providing her with a sensible reason to show us additional layers to her personality. I know I've been talking a lot about Katara and Zuko's personality so far, and while that may seem odd in a video about how to introduce your world and your own stories, I believe they go hand in hand. The first pages and chapters of a story are the most important because they have the responsibility of capturing your audience's attention enough to convince them to continue investing in your story. Because of that, your introduction to your world has many goals to accomplish. Your world needs to be interesting enough to intrigue your audience, and your primary characters need to be compelling enough to make your audience at least curious about them. To me, the most effective stories I've read or watched accomplish these goals by committing to presenting the world and its problems through the lens of a well thought out point of view character. And that is why I keep mentioning Katara and Zuko, what Katara and Zuko are experiencing in each of these settings. As for the change Katara experiences in this part of the episode, it's simple but significant. While various characters have mentioned the war throughout the episode, this is the first time we get a taste of how real the war really is. Katara says the ship is a very bad memory for her people, and the dark, cold colors of the area support her claim. Then, when they go inside the ship, the setting becomes confined and cramped, and if I were writing this section, I would take out some time to write out how the narrow hallways and small rooms are amplifying Katara's uncertainty and discomfort. The armory is the first time we see actual weapons in the episode, and Katara seeing them presents a sensible opportunity for her to actively think about the trauma the Fire Nation has inflicted upon her people. We can then use that recollection to have Katara bond with Aang when they talk about what happened to the air nomads at the start of the war 100 years ago. My overall point with why I feel the first episode of Avatar the Last Airbender is so good at world building is that each of the 5 locations we visit set up future payoffs, provide us with new information, and reflect the thoughts, feelings, and personality of the point of view characters in those moments. Okay, so now that I've spent more time than I thought I would talking about the settings, I think it's time we move on to the next main category I want to talk about: how Avatar the Last Airbender cultivates its culture through character design. One of my favorite things about Avatar the Last Airbender as a whole is how consistently it demonstrates the effectiveness of the idiom, less is more. And, in my opinion, this idea is on full display when it comes to the show's general character design. The world is comprised of 4 different nations: the Northern and Southern Water Tribes, the Earth Kingdom, the Air Nomads, and the Fire Nation. Each of these nations possess their own nuanced cultures, and their differences are shown to us on a surface level via the clothes the characters from each nation wear. It may not seem like much, but quick visual identifiers can be an effective way to communicate minor, necessary information without affecting the tone, pacing, and action of a given scene. Avatar the Last Airbender uses color palettes as a primary visual identifier. For example, people from either water tribe were blue, citizens of the Earth Kingdom were green, the Air Nomads favor yellow and orange, and the subjects of the Fire Nation were black and red. Now, keep in mind that this is not always the case, see Zuko and Iroh in the Earth Kingdom or Ty Lee, but it's generally true on a macro level. Part of the reason why I think Avatar the Last Airbender manages to use this technique so effectively is that the show understands when a character's appearance needs to be noticed and when it can be ignored. For example, when we first meet Sokka and Katara, neither of them pay any mind whatsoever to their attire. This makes perfect sense since they have worn similar garb their entire lives. However, when they meet Aang, he looks vastly different from them and anyone they've ever seen, so they are naturally curious and uncertain about him. One thing I want to talk about though is how to convey this kind of information in your own work. Using Katara as a point of view character, if I were writing the opening scene in the episode, I would only describe what Sokka looks like because she looks at him. There is no point during the first episode where Katara actively takes the time to consciously think about her own appearance, so there's no reason for her to describe herself with an inner monologue. The work around for writing her introduction without describing what she looks like is having her describe Sokka and the villagers. When the audience finds out that Katara and Sokka are siblings, then they will transpose a majority of his traits onto her. Many of those traits will be further enforced when the audience learns that many of the villagers look similar enough to Sokka. So, while a reader might not learn what Katara looks like exactly in the first chapter, they will still have enough information to get a good enough approximation until she either interacts with her own appearance or the story switches to another point of view character who looks at her. This logic also applies to Zuko by using Iroh and the soldiers he trains with as proxies. But what about Zuko's scar? I hear you asking. Well, it's simple. Neither Zuko or Iroh acknowledge his scar in the first episode, or say or do anything that relates to how Zuko got the scar in the first episode, so I wouldn't bring it up until that information is relevant to what's happening in the story. However, if you really wanted to convey his scar to your audience, then you could have his section start with him getting dressed in his chamber and look in a mirror. While this is a viable option, I personally dislike it when stories force characters to look in a mirror just so the writers can show us what the POV character looks like. My overall point is that it's fine to hold off on Zuko's scar until another point of view character looks at him, or until the story makes him acknowledging it sensible. As far as Aang is concerned, we don't have any of these issues with him since he's not the point of view character and is part of the story, and Katara's intrigue with him provides us with ample opportunity to describe him. Now I want to shift gears and spend some time talking about how the first episode of Avatar the Last Airbender introduces its power system. Bending is one of my favorite takes on elemental magic for several reasons. However, this isn't a video on power systems, so I'm going to try to limit myself to only talking about how Avatar the Last Airbender goes about introducing bending in its first episode. The first example of bending that we get is with Katara near the beginning of the episode. This is a fantastic example of how to show and not tell, because during the scene, neither of them talk about what bending is until after Katara demonstrates it. Then, even when Katara tries to give us a wordy explanation of what water bending is, Sokka cuts her off and dismisses the importance of bending. This is great writing because the writers understand that in that moment, the history of the water tribe and the mechanics of water bending are not the focus of what's happening. Bending is simply something Katara can do, and is further expanded upon later, so right here in its introduction, a simple demonstration is all we need. This trend of demonstration preceding explanation happens again with both airbending and firebending. When Katara and Sokka first meet Aang, no one talks about airbending until Aang sneezes himself out of the scene. And even then, we don't get any kind of detailed explanation on what airbending is until Aang demonstrates how his glider works in the village. As for firebending, we first see Zuko using it on his warship, but just like with waterbending and airbending, no one says anything about it until after we receive a demonstration. Then, after Zuko's brief sparring session, we get a fundamental explanation of what firebending is from Iroh. Now, while introducing 3 types of magical powers in a single episode might sound like a lot, to me, the show makes it work because of the demonstrations and how they're brief, and the explanations we receive vary from person to person. What I mean by that is we get no explanation whatsoever in the first episode of what waterbending is, because Sokka shuts off that conversation before it starts. With Aang, we get a simple explanation of how he uses airbending to fly. Then with Zuko, Iroh provides an actual explanation of what firebending is. Another thing I like about Avatar the Last Airbender is how it goes about introducing bending and how they tie the power system into the personality and goals of the primary cast. For example, Katara is the only waterbender in the Southern Water Tribe, is inexperienced and has no one to train her, so she has the least amount of working knowledge of bending, and so because of that we receive the least amount of information about her type of bending. With Aang, he is a master airbender, so he can bend as naturally as he breathes. This makes his need to explain unnecessary most of the time, but provides him with the knowledge he needs to explain when required. Then with Zuko, he's like Katara in regards to him being a young bender who is trying to improve, so he does not say anything that teaches us about firebending. However, unlike Katara, he has Iroh, one of the world's greatest firebenders, as a teacher, so he has a source of knowledge that is able to educate him, and by extension us, on how firebending works. And it's because of all of those variations that the introduction of bending does not feel clunky or like info dumping. I've mentioned this before in this video, but learning how to spread out the information your audience needs to understand your world is the key to keeping them from feeling overwhelmed and confused. With all of that said, I think it's time to move on to the final section of this video, how Avatar the Last Airbender uses world building to introduce the primary motivation for each member of the main cast. Since I've been using Katara as my point of view character throughout this video, let's start with how world building introduces her primary motivation. We learn from the opening scenes that she is a waterbender and that she's lost her mother. Now, while we learn a bit later that her father went off to fight the Fire Nation, Katara only mentions her mother when she's yelling at Sokka, indicating that she feels her loss more than she feels her father's absence. Then, when we meet the four-winged penguins, she admits to Aang that she's the only waterbender in the tribe, to which Aang asks her about the northern tribe. This moment is Katara's call to adventure and a point of no return for her, and this entire process feels smooth because the information was dispersed throughout the episode via demonstrations and dialogue. Crafting your story in a way that allows your audience to learn about the world in conjunction with your main cast is an effective way to make your audience attached to both. While Sokka isn't a point of view character here, he is part of the main cast and gets almost as much screen time as his sister Katara. In the opening scenes on the boat, we learn that he feels that he is the provider and protector for him and his sister. We also learn in the same scenes that he is pretty immature and has room to grow throughout the show. However, it isn't until the scene where he's trying to mold the kids into warriors that we learn about his primary motivation. Throughout our time in the village, we saw that there were no men in the village, and Sokka is the oldest male in his community. His actions in conjunction with this fact tell us that the reason he is trying too hard on the boat and with the kids is because he feels like protecting his community is his responsibility. On top of that, his immaturity and brash nature show us how the absence of his father is affecting him. So, through world building, we learn that Sokka lost his mother, that his father and all the other adult men in his tribe are not around, that the Fire Nation attacked his village at some point in the past, and that his sister is the only waterbender in the tribe. When all of this information is added onto his brash reactions, we learn that his primary motivation is to live up to what he believes a man of the Southern Water Tribe should be, and by extension how much he needs his father. While I spent a fair bit of time on Katara and Sokka, I'm not going to talk that much about Zuko's motivations here. And the main reason for that is his scenes are brief, and if anything, his interests and motivations are more so told to us instead of shown. He and Iroh talk about his honor and how he needs to learn advanced firebending to capture the Avatar, but we did not receive any context as to why that matters to him or why we should care. I know we get all of that information later on, and that I've talked a lot about the importance of pacing and spacing out information, but here is an example of where we do not get enough context in the episode to make what we are told relevant. This is why I said I'm not a fan of switching point of view characters mid-episode, and why I feel Zuko's introduction would be better served with him being the point of view character of episode 2. Now, if that were the case, then most everything I've said about Katara so far would double for Zuko. And that leaves us with the main protagonist, Aang. Now, honestly, Aang kind of falls into the same boat as Zuko here, but I think that's more understandable for Aang. First, he is not the point of view character in this episode, and Katara knows virtually nothing about him. Second, since Aang spends so much time with Sokka and Katara, we do get small hints about Aang throughout the episode, like when Katara asks Aang if he knew the Avatar. Third, since Katara is the point of view character, part of Aang's appeal to her is how mysterious his circumstances are, which in turn adds that appeal to the episode as a whole. Fourth, since we receive hints throughout the episode about Aang's life, circumstances, and turmoil, when we get the conversation between him and Katara in the Fire Navy ship, we have the context we were lacking with Zuko, which makes the information we receive matter more to us. As for what his primary motivation is, we learn that he was in the ice for 100 years and he feels the need to see how the world's changed in that time, while also wanting to help his new friend find a waterbending teacher. Okay, and with that, I think I've covered just about everything I wanted to in this video, so I guess it's time to wrap it up. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, then I want to say thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed my content. If you did, then please consider leaving a like, a comment telling me what you thought of the video, and subscribing to my channel for more videos like this every 2 weeks. I also have a Twitter and a Discord server, so if you're a writer looking to network with other writers, or if you just enjoy my content, then feel free to give me a follow and join the server. Links for all my social media platforms will be in the description below. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.